Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Day Trips in Jewish History with Hana Werner. I'm filling in for Daniel Silberman, who is away on in Israel or on the way to Israel not for fun, I think for business. Hana is continuing her series. Today she's talking about the founding of Hasidism, Jewish. What might be aptly described as the first Jewish renewal movement, not the same as the renewal movement in the United States that began in the 50s and 60s, but a different type of renewal movement which opposed Nagdic forces in an earlier century. And I will not lecture on it. I'll turn it over to Hana, who will entertain us on Hasidism. Take it away, Hana.
Thanks, Lauren. Thank you so much. And we've had many day trips. This one, well, last week, of course, we went all the way to Jerusalem in our day trip, and we saw the upheaval that was going on in Jewish society, in shall we say, Israelite communities, specifically in Jerusalem, and how the upheaval was really a new impetus, I guess, a new push to reframe Judaism. And once again, we have something of that nature. We have a very charismatic leader, the most unlikely of all people to become a leader of Jewish life. And we'll look at the beginnings of this little boy who was an orphan. And as you know, the community is responsible to help orphans and widows. That little boy, Israel, became someone that the community needed to support and give him a little job. And in fact, I thought that he had a wonderful job. He had a little job to take children from their home to their cheder to learn in the morning, and he would sing songs with them. And that's Israel that we are going to talk about. Now, you don't know him as Israel, you know him as the Baal Shem Tov, or you've heard of him as the master of a good name. Let's start with something that we know well. I think most of us really do, and that is a little book or a little story by a man called Shalom Aleichem. You've seen that. I know you have, whether it's a play or whether it's a movie. Shalom Aleichem was obviously a wonderful, insightful author whose writings mirrored the reality of those days. And what did we see? We saw Tevye, right, the dairyman, and what is he saying? If I were a rich man, if I were, and you can see that he's not leading a life of a rich man. He's quite poor. He's in our, I guess, Hollywood style, we've made him look very, very interesting. But the songs really do indicate that life wasn't so great if I were a rich man. And he then, of course, explains how wonderful that would be. In my book, it says that in fact, Shalom Aleichem is the Mark Twain of those days. And what he's got is a young man or an older man, Tevye, the dairyman. And it really, really mirrors, it echoes the difficulties of Jews in those days in the Pale of Settlement, which was really Russian territory. And he says, I was, with God's help, born poor. What does that mean? I was born poor. Well, Tevye is saying, and Shalom Aleichem is really saying or writing, that the helpless masses had a real struggle in life. And in spite of that, you know, they have a discussion with God. God, does it matter to you if I would be born rich? Why should I be born poor? And he has this very interesting dialogue. I love it. So Shalom Aleichem wrote about these helpless masses. And he indicated that life was really not a picnic. Jewish people had the plight of being Jewish. A Pale of Settlement, by the way, meant it was like a very, very, very large ghetto. And most of the Jews were confined to that area. And we're going to be looking at one part of that area very, very close to Kiev in our day trip today. Not far from Kiev, which is, of course, in the Ukraine. And that's what we'll look at. So being a Jewish in the Pale was not easy. If God wants it that way, says Tevye, if God wants it that way, that's the way it ought to be. And yet, what would I take for it to be different? But even as they laughed, and we love Tevye, it doesn't matter who portrays him, we see the reality. You know, there's a wagon, there's a horse, there's, you know, animals. It's not exactly high class of any kind, except that we love the way it comes across. So why do I mention that? Because we're looking at the poverty. We're looking at the enormous, enormous poverty of the masses. And this is when a Hasidic movement comes in. Now, what is the Hasidic movement and who's the founder? I mentioned that this little boy was an orphan, born to elderly parents who finally had a little boy, but they died younger, and he was supported by the community. He loved to go to the forest and roam around, and he loved to have that kind of independence. So he wasn't exactly a disciplined little boy who sat in the cheder. And eventually, as I said, you know, the community saw the need to help him and provided him with the job of taking children back and forth. And he loved to sing with them. What did he sing? He probably sang all kinds of blessings that they learned in school and all of that. And so we're looking at a little boy who didn't have a great start in life, but he definitely had an independent spirit. He grows up to be a very charismatic young man, but he's not yet starting anything. For most of us, are we familiar with the Hasidic movement? I think we are. We're familiar with one of these many, many branches of the Hasidic movement. There are many of them. One of them is the Lubavitch. And I know you've heard of the Lubavitch, and sometimes they're called Chabad. And we'll explain why they are called Lubavitch and what is it that became Chabad. Let's understand the most important political reality for European Jews in those days is based on two, I would call them catastrophes. The first one that I want to address is in 1648-49, about 10 years of war. Let's understand what many of the Jews are doing. Because they're more educated and literal and right, they can read, many of them get a job to manage and take care of the estates of noblemen. At that time, this is Poland and of course the Ukraine. And at one point, because the peasants are so bitter and angry, they get organized by a man called Khmelnytsky. He's very anxious to organize these peasants and create a rebellion. They are Cossacks, mostly, and that is in the Ukraine. We hear about the Ukraine just about daily, right? Because often we talk about the Kiev and the Ukrainian, what is today Ukraine. In those days, it may have been called something else because, you know, the borders move around in Europe. Why are we concerned about a man called Khmelnytsky? Well, because he's so good at organizing a rebellion among the poor peasants who are coming, and their anger is really against the Polish noblemen and the Poles in general, but the people who are vulnerable and the people that they attack Many of them are Jewish people. We know that throughout history that happens. The Jews, and some of them, as I said, are managers and tax collectors for the noblemen, for the estate. They are often targeted. As the Jews are trying to defend themselves, and the Poles, of course, are not able to defend them either, there is a terrible, terrible, and I can't even exaggerate that. It's a time of massacres. It's a catastrophe in the life of Jews wherever they're living, plus the Polish. Today, we're concerned with what happens to these Jewish people. At the end of this terrible, terrible war that in Hebrew is called Gezerot Tach V'Tat, with Khmelnytsky, who may or may not be well known as the organizer. The Cossacks often come, with horses, and they are cruel to the nth degree. These massacres take place, and a lot of villages are razed, they're disappearing. And Jews in general have lost their livelihood, and they are scrambling. And this is a time of enormous depression among the Jewish population, because they are trying very hard to organize themselves again as little villages. What do we call them? Shtetls, right? A little shtetl. And so this is one very important factor where the Hasidic movement will come in to fill a need. It's important for us to understand that when something new is offered, it is answering the need of the Jewish community. So we've looked at, number one, the Khmelnytsky massacres of the peasant movement coming in to vent their anger. There is another big factor in those days in Europe. And again, we are looking at the 17th century. This other one may be well known. Remember that there is tremendous, tremendous outcry because people are suffering. And along comes a young man who adopted the name of Shabtai Tzvi, and he proclaims himself eventually to be the Messiah. People are so anxious in their prayers to God that someone somewhere will come and save them from their terrible misery, their terrible, terrible pain. Shabtai Tzvi is a very, very bright man, and he's originally from Turkey. And he finds that there is a lot of people willing to accept him as the Messiah. And he's not the only one in those days, but he's probably the one of the most celebrated among pretenders, or he may have believed that he was the Messiah. And he gathers an awful lot of followers. And there's even a name, somebody in Palestine who is kind of celebrating this new Messiah, who eventually ends up in Egypt and gets married to somebody who says, oh, I will only marry the Messiah. So there's a lot of wonderful stories about him. And people are so convinced, so willing to be convinced that he's the Messiah, that some people even sold whatever they did have and were getting ready to follow this Messiah to the land of Israel, because they have waited in Europe for the Messiah to come and bring the Jewish people to the land of Israel. So why am I telling you this? Number one, we know that eventually we find out that he's not the Messiah at all. Even if he believed it or didn't, we don't know. He may be a fraud, or he may have believed it. But what he announces one day is that he's going to Turkey. Remember that Palestine at that time is also controlled by Turkey. He's going to Turkey. He's going to have an audience with the Sultan, and he's going to become a king of some sort. The Sultan sees him as a terrible threat and eventually simply offers him the opportunity to become a Muslim or death. He has a choice. And does he make a choice? Yes, he becomes a Muslim, and everyone who really believes in him is either completely devastated because he was such a disappointment and people are now even more depressed, and other people want to believe that this is all part of his plan. The plan was that he'll become a Muslim and other people start to follow him. He continues to live in great luxury, even when he's in jail. This is another factor in this whole picture of the fertile ground into which we're going to find a new, a reframed, a reinvigorated Judaism coming as an answer to the need of the Jewish people. One, such poverty. Two, so many people died. It's estimated, and it's just an estimate, that 100,000 Jewish people died. But what are we learning? That at the end of the day, the Jewish people are questioning, just like we did or we do about the Shoah. Where is God? What happened to all our prayers? What happened to our sense that Judaism is there to lift us up when the people are so terribly depressed? There is tremendous outcry. And at that point, people who are still alive and finding a place to live, one of the things that happens is that when people are struggling to make a living and to just make sense of life, they're not going to be very busy sitting and learning. That's not going to be their focus. And we really want to understand that. For many, many generations, people believed that Judaism is meant to be a religion for people who are knowledgeable. They know how to read, they know how to pray, they know how to do all the mitzvot. But these poor people in Europe, in the area of the Ukraine and Poland, have been plunged into a terrible, terrible depression. And they feel worthless. The people who manage to continue being comfortable, they look down upon these ignorant Jews. The ignorant Jews feel like they are really at the end of their sense of Judaism being a religion that gives you a feeling of optimism and hope. And now, if we understand the terrible, terrible reality, the political and reality in Europe at that time, then we'll understand why there are those people who are so anxious to listen to a man whose background is perhaps not education at all. What he does so well is to be a faith healer, a healer who has adopted the way to deal with people, both as a homeopathic person, actually, because he learned all about all of these grasses and stuff in the forest from the peasants. And he is coming out, the tradition tells that he comes out at the age of 36 with his beautiful ideas. Let me tell you how he formulates these ideas. Because people are so depressed that they're ignorant and that they're so poor, he focuses on the joy. In Hebrew, we say, Ivdu et Hashem besimcha. I'm going to worship God with joy, the joy of prayer, the joy of doing anything that is called a mitzvah, because God loves all people, the educated and the uneducated. They have understood through the preaching of this man, who eventually gets the name of Baal Shem Tov, a master of a good name. He helped people remember that it reflects a time in the early 18th century, a time when people are very anxious to listen. And there's a lot of superstitious people. There are people who are trying to understand the Kabbalah. There are people who are, so they're all groping. The Baal Shem Tov, a man who has come in to really empathize and bring in a complete new approach to Judaism. You don't have to be learned because God loves you as long as you pray with all your heart, with enthusiasm, which he called itlahavut, with a sense of coming closer to God, which he called dveikut. He has a vocabulary to make people understand that in their fervor of singing and dancing and praying to God, God will accept their prayers, even if they don't understand the words. And one of them, I mean, there are so many beautiful stories about the Hasidic movement. And one of the things that illustrates it is about the little boy who came into the shul and he doesn't know how to read and how to write, because probably his father doesn't know either, and he couldn't teach him. And probably there weren't any, perhaps no money to even send a child to a school. It's the little boy at the end feels that he cannot participate in the prayers. Apparently he takes out his flute and he starts to play because he knows how to play the flute. And everyone is absolutely astounded. Oh, what's happening? And the rabbi says, no, he's opening the gates of heaven. The story, and now of course, the Baal Shem Tov also used a lot of parables and a lot of stories. And people love these stories. And they loved this Baal Shem Tov who is singing and dancing in spite of the fact that some people thought, whoa, is that the way to really worship? Is the most important thing not to study? He's trying to explain that everyone can come closer to God by doing mitzvot, by having a very sincere way of approaching God with prayers and with injecting songs into the prayer. And you know that when you come to shul and they're singing and you love to sing with everyone, because that injects a wonderful spirit. And so the Hasidic movement is that kind of a movement that sees the need to reinvigorate and reframe and put in a different slant. And for that reason, it succeeds tremendously. It does start to spread out in different places. But first, the Baal Shem Tov himself, the master of a good name, will have lots of disciples that come to him and want to learn from him. And those disciples will literally take in the meaning that the Baal Shem Tov injected into Judaism, a new Judaism. And what happens then? People start to be very suspicious. There's kind of a new Judaism. What exactly is this? How come we're dancing and singing and even drinking? What's happening? So some people are very suspicious, but I want to explain to you what happens. A lot of these disciples who have learned the beautiful way in which the Baal Shem Tov approaches each and every person. I want you to understand something. He was a very humble man with very humble beginnings. And he had a wife who helped support him because at the time he was very, very, very poor. And the Baal Shem Tov injects that sense of humility. He himself never wrote anything. His disciples did, but he never wrote anything. His focus was on how to treat each other, on loving one another and loving God. And how do we love God? Because when we pray to him, we inject a sense of joy into our prayer. And so what were the words? Dveikut, which is cleaving to God. Kavanah, which is concentrating on what it is that we're doing. In other words, don't let bad thoughts come in. Don't let the evil thoughts invade your thinking. Focus on joy, focus on kavanah, which of course is intention. Focus on dveikut, which means that through prayer, I'm coming closer to God, cleaving to God. Focus on hitlahavut, which is enthusiasm. Be passionate about what you're doing. What does a man like that do for Jewish people who are poor and desperate? He manages to make the people feel that God loves them, that they are not removed from God, which is what they felt as poor, lowly people. When this movement starts to spread, it's spreading because it's answering the need to attain a sense of joy. That Judaism speaks to us through the joy that we can make in every single day as part of our life. And therefore, they no longer feel diminished, they feel uplifted. And that's part of the genius of this man who focused on, as I said, homeopathic remedies, on giving amulets. What's an amulet? An amulet is simply something that you can wear around your neck, if you like, and it's got something written in it. He didn't write anything special in it. I believe he wrote his name in it. People in those days were so given over to superstition, and they were so ready to adopt anything that made them feel uplifted, spiritually uplifted, because the Baal Shem Tov wasn't giving them money. He was giving them a sense of self-worth. And he was teaching them exactly what a psychiatrist would teach today. Get rid of your evil thoughts. Focus on all this positive. And the positive is injecting joy. And you know yourself, if you inject joy, you will feel more joy. If you'll see good, you'll feel more good. Things like that. So we started with Tevye, and Tevye, of course, has, right, Tevye in the Fiddler on the Roof story, which we know so well. And let me tell you what happens along the way before it even spreads much more. There are people who are horrified. What is this new Judaism? They're quite horrified and they're very worried. A long time before that, about 2,000 years, no, 1,700 years before that, there was a man who came and he was Jewish too. His name was Jesus. And look what happened. So they're very, very worried. Let me point out to you who is the great leader who is opposed to the Hasidic movement. The great, great leader in those days is called Elijah, Eliyahu. And we give him a name as well, a Gaon, a genius, if you like, a Gaon from Vilna. Vilna is and always was a place, before the Shoah, of course, a place of great learning, a place of extraordinary scholars who would come and learn the Talmud. They didn't, quote unquote, waste their time in singing and dancing for prayer because they want to devote their time to learning Talmud. Learning is the big pillar in Judaism, and therefore they were astounded. These Hasidic people are not focusing on learning. In fact, they're ignorant. Rabbi from Vilna, Elijah, he himself was not only a genius in Judaism, he himself was well learned in math, in science. I read that he knew 10 languages. He devoted his time to learning. And when it became obvious that this movement is spreading around in East Europe, he was so astounded that he decided that he's going to excommunicate the Hasidim. The Hasidim, by the way, Hasidim is not a new word. There used to be Hasidim, in the early part of 1700 years earlier. But the Hasidic movement in the 18th century is a term used, it's from the word chesed or chasid, it's a term used to denote the followers of the Baal Shem Tov and his disciples. His disciples, of course, spread out all over. And this Vilna Gaon is astounded. What happened? Look how it's spreading, this Hasidic movement. And decides that he's going to excommunicate them. It is a way of saying you are not part of the Jewish community. Out. You're not legitimate, so to speak. You've done something. It might have worked, but the reason that it didn't work is that the Hasidic movement was very, very powerful. As I told you before, it was coming in to fill a need. And many people who originally opposed him got to know him, and became totally devoted to what he was teaching. Now, it does change. Let me explain what changes. A lot of us will see a street called Chabad. We're familiar with the name Lubavitch or Satmar or other Hasidic sects. As these disciples spread out to different cities, they acquire the name of the city. So if we say a Lubavitcher Rebbe, he actually comes from a town called Lubavitch. In other words, they acquired the name of the town in which they set up their, if you like, their home. Do you remember, how many people remember Chaim Potok had a film and a book? Do you remember the name of the book was The Chosen? And it really shows you that these tzaddikim, there's a dynasty, and very often the son of this tzaddik or leader or Hasidic leader, the son would take over. In that book, of course, we see that the son doesn't want to take over as the leader of that movement in that place. What we understand then is this: where the Baal Shem Tov was, if you like, the greatest charismatic leader, and many disciples come to be with him and learn from him. Eventually, they spread out to different towns in Eastern Europe, and in each one of these places, they set up their, if you like, headquarters, which means that they acquire a following. Very often this man would be called a tzaddik. That tzaddik means that he's a leader in that area, and very often would really live on a very high level financially, because people would flock to him and they would come and they would bring and they would help support him. That tzaddik then becomes a powerful leader who is bringing in the Hasidic movement, but very often would bring in his own version of it. So now I want to explain to you why, let's say, the Hasidic movement that became very popular in a place called Lubavitch is different. Just one explanation or one example. The Hasidic movement really starts out as a very strong movement for the uneducated. to give them a sense of pride in who they are. But the Lubavitch in that town, they feel that learning is very important. In fact, they feel that there are three things that they want to emphasize. And that is the acronym of Chabad: a chet for wisdom, a bet for understanding, and a daled for da'at, which is knowledge. In other words, they took three-pronged approach to how that branch of the Hasidic movement will grow. It will grow by emphasizing that wisdom, learning in order to understand better, and learning in order to have more knowledge, be more knowledgeable Jews, is the way that they want to bring Jews back into the Judaism. And we know that Judaism was always based on knowledge, on learning. That's what the Lubavitch emphasized again. And I didn't say that they're the only sect, but they're so well known because their leader can tell them to go to very remote places on earth, whether they will build up a new community there or just bring Yiddishkeit to that part of the world. This is what they have been very successful in doing. And therefore, you'll see right here in Toronto, more than one Chabad center. So the Lubavitch, remember, it's not a title. It's basically a place in Eastern Europe. And from there, as we know, it actually came to North America. So that's important to understand because it's a title that we thought was different, but it's really a city, a place. I'd like to tell you that eventually the Hasidic movement does become, if you like, legitimate. Originally, as I said, in Eastern Europe, they were excommunicated. Did that stop the spread of the Hasidic movement? No, it didn't spread it. It didn't stop at all. It continues to spread. And it says in one of my books that maybe half of Eastern European Jews at that time really embraced the Hasidic way of life, showing us how powerful it became. For the opponents, which are called mitnagdim, against those who are against the Hasidic movement, for those opponents, they were hoping that this is just a passing fad, that it will disappear. You and I know that, and it makes a very strong impression on people because it brings in a different slant, a different way of reframing Judaism. We learned last week that Yochanan ben Zakkai comes in and says, Judaism will continue to be alive and well if we put in the pillars of learning and deeds of loving kindness and prayer. That's what he did. And it really just reframed Judaism. Today, we're once again looking at a leader who understood that there's a need to look at what is the depression, the sadness, the catastrophe that has happened to European Jews, and what is it that will give us a new sense of pride in our religion, and not be swept up by superstitions and not be swept up by things that may just be disappointing. What was so disappointing? The man who claimed that he was a Messiah, Shabtai Tzvi, claimed it. Other people were greatly, devastated. Because as I told you, some people literally sold their stuff and they were ready to follow him. When all of this letdown really created a crisis in the life of European Jews, specifically East Europe. The same thing with the terrible, terrible pogroms. We call pogrom is a Russian word, right? The terrible way of conquering, killing, massacres all around. That's what happened in 1648-49. By 1736, in comes in a new, is it new? Or is it the way that he introduced it so that Jews will be very, very comfortable and secure in Judaism? Comfortable and secure. That doesn't mean that there wasn't a lot of strife. I told you, the opponents are called mitnagdim. The Hasidic people are the ones who are coming in with, there was a lot of strife, but eventually those who are opponents become more tolerant. Those who are called Hasidim become more learned and focus more on the learning of our texts. And so the gap is no longer so wide, and the gap is filled in by more Jews learning and more Jews being tolerant of a Judaism that is meant to stay. It's not a passing fad. We see that today. Let me quote from a couple of books, because I always like to share some ideas with you. And of course, you'll be able to ask questions. I'd like to be able to tell you, and there are lots and lots of good books about that, and I love it. So what we see, of course, in the various books, that, and here's what it says, the Besht. He said, mind, said the Besht, is the foundation of man. Mind is the foundation of man. If the foundation is solid, the building is secure. By the same token, if a man's mind is filled with holy thoughts, his action will be sound. But if his mind is occupied with selfish thoughts, even his good actions are unsound, being built on a weak foundation. So remember that he is focusing on something holy. Holy means doing things for the sake of God. So the love of God and its counterpart, the fear of God or reverence for God, are linked, because we concentrate on the worship of God. And once, when the spirit of the Besht was so downcast that it seemed to him he would have no share in the world to come, he said to himself, I truly love God, and our love of God should be more like the love between family, right? And we have that tradition. We should not imitate those who are, so here's the point. He was worried that people will be taken up with superstitions, and he wanted to create a purity in the way that people worship God. So in the spiritual system of the Besht, Besht, by the way, is an acronym. I didn't explain it, I'm sorry. From the Hebrew words Baal Shem Tov, we take the Bet for Baal, a Shin for Shem, which is name, and Tov, a T for Tov, which is good. So it's an acronym of Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good name. And he was assigned that name. There were other people who claimed to be Baal Shem. They, so to speak, they say the name of God. But what he was really, he became the man who advocated the worship of God. And he's called the Baal Shem Tov. So the concept of the fear of God was associated with the idea of repentance. I really need to explain that. There were people in those days who thought, they thought, you know, if I fast more and if I make life even more difficult, then maybe that will bring God into my life, or it'll bring the Messiah or whatever. All of these things were ideas that went around, and people were fasting. You've heard of people fasting at least once a week. I think it was also because they were very, very poor. But what it says here is that the idea of repentance and also the attachment or cleaving to God, which I called the Hebrew word, the dveikut, it's like, devik is like glue, being close to God. So he underscored the love of God, and the best appreciated the value of fear of God, of course, the reverence for God. To him, there were two kinds of reverence, right? We fear punishment, but we really, and fearing punishment is part of our Torah. And so he said very often, instead of bringing sadness and evil thoughts into your mind, bring joy and make life filled with joy. And what did I tell you about the tzaddik before? The tzaddik became one of the leaders of a sect, if you like, a part of the movement. This is important because there were those people who felt that the leader, that tzaddik in different towns, became a little bit more than, if you like, more than human, that he was elevated on a pedestal. And they were worried about that because that almost sounded a little bit Christian, that he was no longer given just plain human ways. And they worried that, and maybe they still do, that this man, and we know, for example, that long ago, people thought that the Lubavitcher Rebbe was actually a Messiah. They really talked about that. So the word tzaddik, okay, in ordinary Hebrew, tzaddik means a man who's doing the righteous things, right? He's doing tzedakah, which is the righteous thing to do. In the language of the Hasidic movement, a tzaddik is a leader of that sect of Hasidic movement. So within the big umbrella of the Hasidic movement, there are many tzaddikim, each one being a leader, originally set up in Eastern Europe and eventually brought over to this part of the world, right? So it says, it's the same with the tzaddik. He must rid himself of his evil inclination and continue to do so in life. But there are always some people who perhaps are not as sincere. I remember that the best really advocated the sincerity. And that's why he was talking about hitlahavut and veikut, all of that. So the best was venerated, I told you. But he himself never took upon or never looked upon himself as extraordinary. He shared in the traditional, because he never said that he's the Messiah. His humility is so special. So he said that he emphasized that Jews have a responsibility. And our responsibility is the way we live and the way we treat one another. And I wanted to tell you just a little bit more, if I may. That he emphasized again and again the importance, and you'll be surprised, I think you will be. Remember I told you that he also used various grasses and plants for some medication, and sometimes people would be healed, just like we do today, right? So he said about joy and good health, right, and good cheer, that is important for the Hasidic movement. And then it says, in the way of life recommended by the best, he gave practical application of his ideals, and he emphasized again and again the importance of good health and normal activity. Isn't that interesting? Good health, normal activity, saying, do not consider the time that you spend for eating or sleeping wasted. No, the soul within you is rested during these intervals and is able to renew its holy work with fresh enthusiasm. You may be free from sin, but your body has to be strong. So what is he saying? Maintain your health and preserve your strength. Isn't that amazing? It's really very interesting. So he laid great stress upon having a bath, a ritual bath, music played a decisive role in the community of his Jewish people, and that's what he helped to fashion. There was some drinking of wine and being very happy, merriment and happiness. That is a Hasidic way of life as well. Remember that all of these things evolve. The best is active for a short time. Anyways, according to tradition, he comes out in 1736, and according to tradition, he dies in 1770, but I don't, 1760, sorry, 1760, right. So dancing was a major interest in the Hasidic in their effort to express worship, and on Simchat Torah, the best. Now, you know that when they talk about the Farbrengen, it's meant that there's going to be singing and dancing, and there's going to be eating, there's going to be a tish. What does a tish mean? It's a table, literally just a table where there's going to be some food and enjoyment. So out of the Hasidic dances, intricate and decorative art forms have developed, which have found their way into even into the theater. And we know very well, we just talked about Fiddler on the Roof. Is that true? Well, Fiddler on the Roof really showed, there's no fiddler on any roof. That's only, Fiddler on the Roof is just Shalom Aleichem putting this, but really, I'm not sure that anyone saw Fiddler on the Roof in these shtetls. I'm not sure. But what was worrisome is that the aristocratic Jews looked down upon the poor Jews. He helped give them a sense of self. So the Hasidic movement is derived from the rabbinic statement attributed to Hillel: an ignorant man cannot be pious. This is what, so the Hasidic movement is trying to discount some of the major ideas that went in Judaism for a long time, and that includes that only knowledgeable people are welcomed by God. That, I mean, do you know, by the way, that I mentioned to you about Rabbi Elijah, the Gaon from Vilna. He knew so much about math and science. And Maimonides himself, way before, always advocates that we need to learn. All of this gives us a better understanding of Torah, that learning is important. So sometimes what we're learning is that a leader comes out on the scene. He's visionary. He sees a vision of what the people really need. And he is brilliant enough to come out with a mission for himself, a mission that will bring a new sense of well-being to the Jewish community. That's the mission of the best, to be literally a faith healer and bring a sense of well-being to the community, because that's what people need. Now, there were plenty of parables and folk beliefs and folk ways. There were many ideas that were floating around. That is true. But what he's saying, and remember I told you about, do you remember that a while ago we used to take little, I don't know, rabbit's foots or something that people thought had some kind of an amulet, something that if they touched it, that it was meaningful. It says here in my book that the amulet is the permanent symbol of the direct influence of the best. And basically it contained his name. And basically, in other words, there was nothing magical about it, but if you believed in him, that's what really was the magic. And through this pledge of personal connection, the person who received it would be uplifted. I think it's very, very interesting about amulets and what it is that can help people feel that someone is really listening to them. And that's what the Besh did. He listened carefully. And he says that our prayer can pierce the firmament. The lowest of the low you can think of is dearer to God, is very, very dear to God. I love it. So I'd like to be able to tell you what, and you've heard, I think, of the wonderful scholar called Heschel. Heschel has something to say about the Hasidic movement because he himself was originally from the Hasidic movement. And so Heschel is saying that the best brought the heaven down to earth. He and his disciples, the Hasidim, banished melancholy from the soul and uncovered the God's delight in their being Jewish. In a really beautiful way, he brought heaven down to earth. He brought them a sense that God cares and God is listening to them. And so we could call their prayer ecstatic. And I think that all of us need to think about that for today as well in our modern times. Prayer was the Baal Shem Tov's main ecstatic and mystic approach to God. Prayer. Intellectual study and learning took a secondary place. I told you that eventually that too changes for some Hasidic sects. And one of the best principal teachings was that prayer is acceptable to God only if it flows from a heart that's filled with joy. Like a good psychiatrist, he advocated that people need to inject joy into their lives. And that is so interesting because it's going back to the year, right? It's going back 250, 300 years. How he managed to readdress, reaffirm the importance of prayer and the importance of joy, because every day we should get up with that sense that joy is part of our life. Let's put a few more things together and then perhaps open it up. Okay, our day trip took us to a place not far from Kiev, Eastern Europe. Lots and lots of Jewish people are very, very much depressed because life has been tough for them economically, spiritually, politically, in every way. There's been a catastrophe, a great big catastrophe. The Besht himself is a person who seeks a lot of time of hitbodedut, being by himself, often in the forest, because that's where he feels really, really good, and eventually becomes a healer, a faith healer. And the people who poured in to listen to him see in him that, if you like, magic, or the charismatic quality of a man who knows the right thing to say to the right people. His opponent, Rabbi Elijah the Gra, he exemplified the Jewish person who is, a scholar par excellence. Great scholarship, knowledge of languages. He knew math, he knew science. He encouraged his followers to study science. He was very different. So these are the two leaders at one time with a great big gap between them, which I told you eventually narrows. And the mitnagdim, the opponents, become more tolerant and they see the beauty as well, because some of those opponents moved over to the Hasidic movement because they became enamored about the way this new movement is speaking to them. And it's very interesting because they loved what they heard. Every single day in our prayers, we say, Ivdu et Hashem besimcha, which means pray to God, worship God with joy, enthusiasm. Martin Buber, the great philosopher, calls it the holy joy. And this kind of thinking gave each poor Jew a sense that he's important too. So if you like, Hasidism is a new stream of Judaism. I've talked to you about last week when we were divided. We're divided in this case as well, but all of the people on either side are excited about the Judaism that they have. It's a religious movement that really tried to exalt the spirit. And we said to be ecstatic, to pray, and really sincerely express what you want to say to God. So speak to God. It became a personal devotion in speaking to God. And the Baal Shem Tov rejected all this fasting and penitence and things that make you feel bad. He rejected that. He just didn't think that that was the way to move forward. So there is strength through joy, he said, and it will bring you closer to God. Now, what happened? I told you before that there was a movement that was called a messianic movement. I want to tell you that there were many people like that came on the scene and claimed to be the Messiah. We know that one by one they were discredited. This one had a great following, which we call Shabtai Tzvi, and he advocated mysticism and the study of Kabbalah and all kinds of superstitions. And we know that that brought a sense of despair when he didn't come through with any of what he was saying, right? That's another reason why this new movement found fertile grounds because they were so terribly despondent. Unfortunately, as I said before, this day trip is going back into the war zone of Ukraine. And it's interesting because we've just described a war or a terrible series of attacks that went on for 10 years that included a man called Khmelnytsky, the leader of many Cossacks. So we need to understand that area where Jews live again today was also a war zone way back then. And they were terribly cruel. And I won't even try to describe, but something very close to the Shoah that we know about today. Some people say, by the way, that there were hundreds of thousands. It's hard to say because in those days, maybe they didn't have census, right? That's why Jews needed a healer of the people. And that became the mission that the Besh took for himself. The mission is to heal people. And I think that that's important. And another couple of ideas, and then maybe share some more text with you, just very little. Because there was so much warmth and joy and songs and dances, all of that lifted up the Jews who became enamored with the Hasidic movement. That kind of stream of Judaism was and continues to be very powerful. These are Jewish people who continue to become enamored of the way of life that the Hasidic movement really advocates. So we've learned about the terrible man called Khmelnytsky, Bogdan Khmelnytsky. We learned about Shabtai Tzvi, who pretended or claimed, or some people claimed that he was a Messiah. We learned the Ukrainian Cossacks and what their role was in bringing the communities to their feet. And we also learned that Jewish people experienced extreme poverty. And therefore, we know that some of these stories that you, or maybe even the film Fiddler on the Roof, really portrays the poverty, the man who is, as you know, he's got 7 daughters and he's pretty worried about that. Therefore, it could have happened that Judaism would become a fossil. But the Baal Shem Tov comes in to reframe and reinvigorate, and therefore made it relevant in turbulent and difficult times. And I think that this is the genius of our leadership, and often I call that the mystery of history. The leadership that brings in a new approach, and by doing that, we're able to once again make the religion relevant in one's life. So his disciple, one of them, is Dov Ber, and he spread the Hasidic way throughout Europe. And it's talking about that because, let me just tell you what it says. Each Hasidic rabbi seized a piece of territory, and soon the Hasidic map resembled, just a lot of dots of Hasidic movement. Hundreds of Hasidic principalities, each maintaining its rabbi. And they believed that the rabbi or this tzaddik needs to be maintained in style. And these offices became hereditary, and soon wisdom, right, and their ability yielded. Now, this is something that I think you've seen in The Chosen, that Chaim Potok tried to portray, that they almost felt that there is a hereditary position given over to the son. Maybe some people actually resented that. I'm not sure, but I think in some cases it was so, because sometimes the son is not as worthy, and that happens as well, right? Okay, and I'm going to just share one more idea, and then please share your ideas. Just to remind you, when you're passing by, if you are, a street called Chabad, which some people say Chabad, it reflects a philosophy that the movement wants to focus on Chokhmah, which is wisdom, Bina, which is understanding, and Dat, which is knowledge. The movement of the poor and the ignorant was therefore transformed by some into a movement that continues to be meaningful, but focuses on learning. In other words, learning is important, and education continues to be very important. And in fact, it says that Shneor Zalman argued on the side of Hasidism, pointing out that a religious leader ought to be, listen to that, a religious leader ought to be an expert in Jewish law and a teacher of rabbinic literature. And he argued that this was important. Who was he agreeing with? The Mitnagdim. The Mitnagdim are the opponents. And he was agreeing with them that leaders of the Hasidic movement must be educated. That's interesting for sure. So I told you that, therefore, the Lubavitch adopted the word Chabad. And once again, if you are asking about the books, I'm happy to share the books that I'm using. And one of the beautiful ones is the one that I mentioned last time, Jewish Literacy. In the book Jewish Literacy, there's a wonderful chapter about the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon was very, very young when he was recognized, being really extraordinary. Gaon in Hebrew means genius, right? And apparently he was so knowledgeable in Talmud. And so the chief rabbi of Vilna interviewed him, and he just couldn't believe what this 7- and 8-year-old had already learned. So he quickly concluded that this young boy is really a Gaon, a genius. And there's a lot more to say, except that I want to be able to tell you that today we don't have a cherem, an excommunication. In those days, he had hoped that that would stem and stop the Hasidic movement from spreading, And we know that it's alive and well today. Questions and comments are welcome anytime. Go ahead. No? Okay.
So Hannah, there's a question in the chat.
Yes.
Someone wrote, are the groups like Eish HaTorah and Or Sameach considered Hasidim?
Wow. I wouldn't call them that, but it may very well be. The reason I don't think so is that although they did have a leader, I think the Hasidic movements generally have a leader that they look up to, and they even go to that leader, that tzaddik, and they ask for advice, and that advice might be about business, that advice might be about marrying somebody. Remember that the Lubavitcher Rebbe would have an audience, I don't know, all times of day and night, and people would come to him with all kinds of different questions, including whether permission even to marry somebody, or even what do you think of the business that I'm going to open? And so although I do know that Rabbi Weinberg was one of the leaders, but I'd have to look into that, and I'd have to.
My opinion is no, they're not.
Good.
They're outreach, or they're modern Jewish outreach organizations, but they really don't have anything to do with Hasidut.
So in other words, what they came in with a lot of Baal Tshuva movements. Right?
That's what it is.
Right. So that's a little bit different, although we could look at the Baal Tshuva movement in general, which is very, very strong. It was especially strong after the 6-Day War, when everyone was so enthralled with the miracle of the 6-Day War, right? And there were a lot of people who suddenly started to come into yeshivot and adopt a Jewish way. Thank you for that, Lauren. And okay.
Any other questions? Doreen.
Hi. I'm curious whether you think that the magnificent, colorful shtetl synagogues, the interiors with all kinds of colors and animals and so on, that were so prevalent in the shtetls, whether those were an outcropping from trying to make people feel good and uplift their soul while they were praying.
So what you've touched upon is, and I read about it as well, that, you know, everything was meant to inject the feeling of the joy of the spirit and the beauty in the eyes, and the sense that, you know, because to be fair, you know, that they were terribly, terribly criticized for spending time to dance. And yet when we dance with the Torah, do we feel that that's wrong? The Hasidic movement has brought in a lot of what they advocated into the conservative movement is doing the singing, and there are times to dance, although they may have danced a lot more. I don't know that they do that today, but in those days, you're right, the eyes needed to take in the beauty, because outside things were grim and gray and horrible. And what they're advocating is that we need to, in every way, bring some joy into life. I like your comment about decorating your environment.
I'm a docent at the new exhibit at the Koffler Center, the Babin exhibit. And
sorry, can I interrupt you for a minute?
Sure.
Everything that I've read is not Babin, it's Babi, B-A-B-I.
That is the Russian pronunciation. So we are exclusively using the Ukrainian because it was, and the same thing with Kiev is Russian. So we don't say Kiev, we say Kiev because it's Ukrainian.
Okay, thank you for correcting.
Yeah, it just started. The exhibit just began. It's going to run through to November, Wednesday to Sunday, 12 to 5, and it's way down in the old more Jewish area, Queen and Shaw. It's on Shaw. But the reason I'm asking about the colors is they said that was typical for the 17th, 18th century, and it doesn't exist. And they felt that the colorful representation is really the only example of folk art that exists. And it's pretty exciting. When you look at it, it's so unchurchy, unsynagogue-y, because in our synagogues, you know, the shtetls, it was animals, it was birds, it was parrots, and beautiful colors. And so that's what is now part of the synagogue. Wow. That is the memorial to the victims of Babin Yar.
Wow. Number one, thank you for correcting my...
it's not a correction. They're both okay. They're both right, but one is Russian, one is Ukrainian pronunciation.
I see. And also, older synagogues, even here in Toronto, have more depictions of animals and flowers. Down in Kensington Market, I believe. So
these were in the old wooden ones, and unfortunately, there's apparently no wooden synagogues left because of the pillaring and the burning and the devastation that was wreaked upon the Pale of Settlement Jews.
Right. The Pale of Settlement really disbanded in 1917, but up until then there was, now to be fair, many of these synagogues were really wooden structures, and they may not have survived anyways, right? For many, many years, unless they were reinforced and rebuilt, or right?
Intended to, which they couldn't afford to, really.
Now, the other thing that you're saying, and that's lovely to know, is that people with, you know, a bent to become artists, and you know, a Chagall type of person would have had an opportunity to decorate a synagogue.
Well, especially because they weren't allowed to be part of the builders, because they were not allowed to be part of trade unions or... Right.
So that meant that their artistic flair could be used,
yes,
in their communities. Yes. And that, I think, is really important, because, you know, some of these things are not learned. They just come through, right? They're talents. Yeah. And do you have a comment? Any other comment about the Hasidic movement today, or do you think anything about that? Do you feel that it's simply bound to spread even more because it's reaching people? It's a pointed question. Let me just explain why. You know, people like the Besht and his disciples would travel around. Remember, this is not a time when information is coming into your inbox, right? The only way that they could spread their form of, you know, Judaism and the joy is by going around to different villages and spreading and coming, right? In order to, if you like, to teach. And in those days, you know, there was the Magid, people who would go around, they would be preaching, they would be teaching, they would be, right? And getting more adherents.
Well, I think that the Satmars are really doing us a big disservice.
Well, they're anti-Zionist, from what I understand, and that's our problem. That's a different, it's an important topic, different. And I appreciate that you mentioned it, except that...
Well, you had mentioned him when you were talking about Chasta, but
right.
So I thought that it was fair to say.
The series of day trips is meant to take us and get a glimpse about how, and that's the constant question, does history produce these leaders, or do leaders impact and produce the history? Okay, in other words, did the Baal Shem Tov come in and produce or had impact upon the history? Or did the history as it was on the ground then create a Baal Shem Tov?
I think the question is indiscernible. I think that the two, the merging of the two, it's
Yes.
the right person at the right time.
Correct, totally. And so he literally, and he's not a likely leader, but what he comes out with has unbelievable influence on the Jewish world, so much so that some people say that half of the Eastern European Jewry was really at one time Hasidic. Can you believe it?
No.
It's quite astounding. Quite astounding. And so it is that sometimes we look at an orphan who has very, very little opportunity, and look what he's accomplished. Look what he has done. Really interesting. Now, don't misunderstand. There are things that are negative as well. I read that in some sects, women walk a few steps behind their husband. It's good. It's all very, very good, because he injected a sense that life is worth living. Don't give up on life. Don't give up on the spirit. Don't give up on God. Don't give up. Just inject the holiness of joy. It's a very interesting comment by Buber. Holy joy. The holiness of joy will have impact on you. Thank you so much. Is there another comment, Alan? Sorry, Lauren.
There are some questions in the chat.
Above, there's one other question. Do Lubavitch come to have a liturgy?
Oh, the liturgy is, as far as I know, the very, very same. Liturgy, even if you examine the liturgy of the conservative and the Orthodox movement, is very, very similar. There are few small differences. As far as I know, the Chabad has the art scroll, don't they? It's probably not the liturgy, it is what you do with it. It's how you approach it. And we just, all of us, I think that these are my parting words for today. And of course, next week we'll hopefully meet again. My parting words is that we need to inject more joy and more love into our daily approach to Judaism.
Okay, everyone. Thank you, Hannah, for this afternoon's lecture, and join us next week for our next session.
Thank you so much.
Have a good day, everyone.
Have a great week.